please, and time to introduce Alan Pascuzzi, who needs little introduction, as he's a regular on our program and a well-known man about town in the arts of Florence. Hails originally from Rochester, New York. Did a master's in the Syracuse program, including a period here, which I suspect is how you started your long connection with Florence. Alan has been, and went on to do a PhD at Washington University in Illinois, I think. St. Louis, Missouri. Okay, never. Just down the road. Yeah, just on 66 a bit. Yeah. And so Alan's been living here and raising his family in Florence for over 20 years. A working artist, employing the techniques of the great masters from the Renaissance, and an art historian who studies particularly how it was done and what was going on behind the scenes. So Alan's our go-to guy for stories about what was going on behind the scenes in the Renaissance. This evening it's the smells of the Bottega. And if any of you want to actually learn a little bit about it, hands-on about some of those techniques, Alan runs a really good studio where he runs courses. You can get to make a fresco and things like that if you want to. So recommended, and there are details on the Institute's website under our, it's a tab called More on the homepage. You look under More and you find some of our friends and partners around town who we recommend. Alan's in there. So that's the introduction. I'll hand over to Alan now. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Let me just get my mic going. I want to thank Simon always for the opportunity to do these talks. It's one of my most favorite things to do. Tonight's talk is entitled "The Smells of the Bottega," and the subtitle is "The Sights, Sounds, and Smells of the Bottega from the Renaissance today to today." Now, I'm going out on a limb tonight, but I'm doing it for a reason. My talk this evening is really unlike other talks that I've given in the past. In this talk, I'm going to attempt to relate something that is even difficult to describe and even more difficult to define in detail. My goal tonight is to recreate the sensory experience of being in a bottega, a workshop, the workshops of the artists and artisans here in Florence. Now, as an artist, I've had the rare opportunity, I consider myself lucky, to have worked in various workshops in the city in order to execute various commissions in sculpture and in painting. And while working in these botteghe, I've had the chance to see firsthand the mastery of the artisans and share their passion for working with your hands. Therefore, tonight I've based my talk mainly on my own firsthand personal experiences working in my own studio in San Frediano, the artisan section of the city, but also frequenting the bottegas of many artisans, and most importantly, getting to know and work with master craftsmen. Now, I've become familiar with the various trades in different workshops, such as bronze foundries, ceramic studios, marble workshops, restorers laboratories, and even woodworkers' botteghe. And in every workshop that I entered, every bottega that I entered, I began to see in all the artists and artisans common work ethic, common dedication, and a common philosophy. The most striking aspect, however, was that each bottega, each trade, each workshop had its own distinct sensory aura that one can still perceive today. Each workshop had its own sights, sounds, but also had its own distinct smell. As an art historian, I began to think that the smells of the workshop of today must have been like those of the master of the Renaissance, ancient odors, so to speak, of the masters of the past. I realized that these were the same smells of the studio of Luca della Robbia, or of the painting studio of Leonardo da Vinci, or of the sculptor's workshop of Donatello and Michelangelo. Therefore, this talk will attempt to somehow bring to life the sensory impact of the bottega, to somehow, if I can be poetic about it, put it under glass, to preserve it, and to try to recreate an almost mystical and ephemeral spirit of the workshop for all to see and appreciate. I'm going to start the talk with something that I read a long time ago in Vasari's Lives of the Artists. And I never understood it then. But what my job is tonight is to sort of bring this realization of what it really means to you. And this is what Vasari says upon the death of Filippino Lippi. And he wrote, I should say, thereupon, having been ever courteous, affable, and kindly, he was lamented by all those who had known him. Nay, he was so excellent in his actions, not only by the excellence of his art, wherein he was inferior to no man of his time, but also by the modesty and regularity of his life, and above all by his courtesy and amiability. And he goes on. Filippo was buried by his sons in San Michele bis Domini on April 13th, 1505. And while he was being borne to his tomb, all the shops in Via dei Servi were closed, as is done sometimes for the obsequies of great men. Now, I never understood that. Why would the workshops in Via dei Servi close for an artist? But this talk is going to try to explain why the artisans, okay, in this gesture of extreme respect, would close their shops, lose a day's work in order to give honor to one of their own. Now, this is what I'm going to try to sort of convey to you. This is an artisan's workshop. This is actually Bruno. His shop is in Via Santa Maria. And this is not a commercial for any of these artisans, obviously. But this is what is fascinating when you can walk into it. This is what I'm going to try to sort of relay to you. The sequence of the talk, however, is going to go through 4 different stages. The first one is the Bottega. I want to define what the Bottega is. I want to give its very quick history from the Roman origins to the Renaissance to today. In the second section, I'm going to get into the artist and artisan, the various trades, and the life in the Bottega. In section 3, that's when I'm going to get into the sights, sounds, and smells of the Bottega. In essence, a sensory exploration of the Bottega itself. And then finally, section 4 are the conclusions. And this is what I want to relay, the philosophy of the Bottega and the philosophy of the artisans themselves. Now, the objectives of the talk. The first is to reveal the word of the Bottega, what they are, who the artists and artisans were in the past and are still today. The second is to relay the sights, sounds, and smells of the Bottega to understand their world, and also try to recreate the atmosphere of the Bottega of the Renaissance masters. And finally, the third objective is to explore the phenomenon of the Bottega in Florence and the philosophy of the workshop that you can still find today. It's what made Florence what it literally is today. Now, section 1, the Bottega. What does the word Bottega mean? If you look at the etymology of the word Bottega, it actually comes from the Greek, Botteghe, which means deposit, or basically magazine or warehouse. When it gets translated into the Latin, it becomes apotheca. And this is when the Romans actually considered this the cellar where the wine was stored, an amphora. Now this in the Italian actually gets transmuted into poteca. And this gets actually used as the basis for enoteca, which I think we can still appreciate and find today. This is where you go and drink wine. But in the common language, the poteca becomes bottega, and it becomes associated with artisans and trades. This warehouse is where the artisans and artists actually began to work. So it gets transmorphed from apotheca, poteca, to bottega, and what we still use today. Now, la bottega existed even in ancient Greece and Rome. We know that every thriving city in Greece had botteghe, had essentially workshops. The Romans, when they conquered the Mediterranean, used this sort of format and transported it into all of the Mediterranean itself. In fact, they then called their botteghe basically taberne, taberne, I should say. And these workshops were basically commercial shops that are found in every major Roman city. And we can still see them today if you go to Rome, Pompeii, Herculaneum, even in Ostia. Now, the taberne were usually one large open space open to the street. And usually the artisans lived above. And even today in Florence, in the rare occasions that there exist, the artisans still live right above their workshops. Now, if you want to go back to what the Romans actually sort of saw, I've actually found this in Livy when he's actually recounting a visit of Marco Furio Camillo to Tusculum, which is a city in Lazio. And this is what he says when he's walking into the city. Camillo entered into the city where he admired the open doors of the taberne and the multitude of wares for sale in the stores, and the artisans all busy with their own trades. Now, what I'm going to show you, what I'm showing you right here, is basically a grave stele of one of these Romans in their workshop, and you can see essentially okay, their wares, their working, okay, their working way, their workmen. Now, if you go to Herculaneum, just as an example, you're going to see these long rows of shops on the very back side of Herculaneum. And this is what you're going to find, the workshop of the Plumbarius, okay, or the Lavanderia. Okay, these still exist today, even though they were destroyed during the eruption of Vesuvius. Now, if we jump up very quickly into the Middle Ages, you're going to still see this concept in this medieval manuscript of this large open bottega. And we have the master and apprentices working inside. And this is what the average medieval street must have looked like. And in fact, here in Florence, we know that all the workshops were organized into guilds, and these were established to maintain quality, okay, the tradition in all the trades. They controlled the workshops, the training of apprentices. And we all know that there were major and minor guilds, 7 major guilds that we have right here, and then 14 minor guilds. These were the primary job opportunities for youths, and Florence was filled with these workshops. In fact, one of the visitors to Florence once said in the Renaissance that all of the workmen were like busy bees, okay, working in their workshops. Now, the guilds, if you're wondering what the artists, okay, actually belong to, there were no painters' guilds or sculptors' guilds. Okay, the painters belonged to the apothecaries' guild because they ground their pigments, okay, like the apothecary. The sculptors belonged to the masons' guild because essentially they were stone cutters. The jewelers were a little bit a higher level, belonged to the silk guild, okay, the very wealthy guild, the refined guild. So all of these artists, and artists, I should say, artists that we know of, were matriculated in one of these guilds. Now, the medieval Botteghe, what did they look like? And our best example, you have to go to Siena, Ambrogio and Pietro Lorenzetti, the Sala della Pace, the effects of good government on the city. And if you look very closely, you're going to see these workshops, these large open workshops with these people working on their wares, the shoemaker, the lecturer, and other people, okay? Essentially, these haven't changed even since ancient times. And if we jump up to the Renaissance with this wonderful print done for the Visconti in Milan, which basically shows how Mercury controls all of the manual arts. And basically, it shows what the Renaissance Bottega must have looked like. In fact, the two that are most interesting, we have the painter, okay, sitting in his shop, painting a triptych, and we have the scribe that's working, okay, copying, okay, a manuscript, all under the guise, all under the control of Mercury as well. Now, when we get into the workshop, and this even transmits even today, we have to get into the concept of the master apprentice. And the best example of how you start into these workshops is given by Cennino Cennini, a treatise from 1399, the Craftsman's Handbook. And this is what he says. He actually gets very sort of almost philosophical about it. He states, "It is not without the impulse of a lofty spirit that some are moved to enter this profession, attracted to them through natural enthusiasm." Now, this could be the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, okay, not just arts. And then through this delight, they come to want to find a master, and they bind themselves to him with respect for authority, undergoing an apprenticeship in order to achieve perfection in all this. And he goes on, there are those who pursue it because of poverty, in other words, to make money, and domestic need, for profit and enthusiasm for the profession too. But above all, these are to be extolled, the ones who enter the profession through a sense of enthusiasm and exaltation. Now, in this small little drawing of Maso Finiguerra that shows a Renaissance apprentice, okay, who's trying to learn his craft, this is a workshop, okay, of Bruno and his son. In fact, we have in many cases the sons or even the daughters that are following, okay, the mothers or fathers into the profession, even today. In fact, all of the workshops I'm going to show you are going to have that exact same sort of setup. Okay, the son or the daughter following essentially, okay, the parent. Now, what we have to get into is the apprentice master process. Okay, this is where you went, and there's this lovely German woodcut with the artist in the center and the various apprentices learning their craft in the various stages. I wish I could go into this, but I'll just briefly sort of describe it. The workshop, the Bottega, were places of production, of small business, and also of training grounds for young artists and artisans. This is where you learned your craft over several years, and it takes years, okay, to learn the crafts that I'm going to show you. Now, just remember that all of the major works of art that we see today, be them in architecture and sculpture or even in painting, were all produced by large and busy workshops that were run by a successful master artist and his teams of assistants and apprentices. So this master apprentice process of the artisans actually can get sort of transferred even to the great, okay, works of art that we see in the city themselves, like Domenico Ghirlandaio and the frescoes of the high altar of Santa Maria Novella, the Tony Buoni Chapel, in which Michelangelo Buonarroti at 13 probably wasn't painting, but probably was cleaning up after a day's work, okay, when Ghirlandaio was in charge. Well, section 2, the artist and the artisan. How can we sort of bring this into today? Like the artisans, the artists had workshops with specialized equipment, materials, and space that they needed for their work. Now, a great example of this is the workshop of Donatello, okay, where he executed his works, okay, on the right. In fact, there's even some better images of it. The guy took this when it was actually sunny yesterday, okay? This is Donatello's workshop where he worked probably with, okay, Michelozzo. And you can still see these large open windows. Now it's a pizza place, okay? And they actually put this little sort of monument dedicated to him. Well, you have to imagine that some of the greatest works of Renaissance art were done in a workshop like this. Well, what did that workshop actually look like? Okay. Well, these workshops are all over the place, not just in Donatello's and Via dei Servi. They still exist in Florence. They're scattered throughout the city. There's a high concentration in streets of Santa Croce, Via dei Macci, for example, and also in San Frediano and the Altoradno, which is the artisan sections of the city. Now, I think that Florence still retains a remnant of the city of artisans through the pizza places and the sandwich shops and the gelaterie. You just have to look. And this is what I'm going to show you today. There's the woodworker, Bruno, who's been working for over 70 years in this profession. And I'll be getting to his workshop in just a moment. And he actually has his son, Livio, who's one of the finest woodcutters, okay, basically wood carvers, still in the city. And this is their workshop. And then there's the stoneworker, Paulo, who is one of the only left in the city who actually works in various stones, works in marbles, who can still, okay, put lead in, okay, writing like the Romans did. He's one of the only ones left in the city. And then there's the ironworker, Michele, okay, who's followed his father's footsteps into working with iron. Okay, and this is also in Via dei Macci, right near Santa Croce. Then there's a ceramicist, Davide, and his shop, which is literally right over where Luca della Robbia probably is still buried, okay, in San Pier Maggiore. And then the paintings restorer, Stefano, okay, who is restoring paintings. He too learned from his father, who was one of the first great restorers in Florence right after the flood of 1966, Umberto Ticci. And then finally, or I should say not finally, the Gilder, Laudo, one of the few gilders in the city who was able to use 23, 24 karat gold, put them on frames to make them look like literally solid gold, pieces of solid gold. And then there's the bronze caster, Jacopo. He's the one on the left, okay? He's all covered up, okay? Who are still using today the same techniques and materials of the ancient Greeks and Romans, the lost wax process as well, to make their, okay, figures in bronze. Now, these are the artisans. But what are the sights, sounds, and smells of the Bottega? Now, if you walk into these Bottega today, if you can find them, and I would heartily sort of ask you to try and find them, the workplace is filled with tools, materials, and dust. And each Bottega has its own sensory, I should say, aura. And each space has its own particular smell. Now, these sights, sounds, and smells, I think, have not changed for centuries. These are historic sights, sounds, and odors of the past. Now, if we get into the woodworker, okay, the woodworker shop, if you walk into Bruno's shop, you have to realize that's the same type of shop that produced the Cassoni panels of the Middle Ages and the early Renaissance. These magnificently decorated and carved, okay, hope chests for females. Or if you walk into the Palazzo d'Avanzati, you're going to see the isfoggiati, these huge tables, or small little sort of jewelry chests. These are all done in workshops of the woodworkers. And if you walk into the woodworker shop, this is what you find. Okay, you find the master Bruno, his apprentice, who's now a master in his own right, Livio. And these are the tools and these are the sights and smells, okay, that you actually experience. When you walk in, on the side of the wall, you're going to see saws, hammers, T-squares, chisels, plans for frames or furniture. If you go and look into the workshop, one of the most prized possessions that you're going to find are these workbenches that have been handed down literally for centuries. The workbench of, okay, the woodworker with its various clamps and clasps in order to hold the piece of wood that you're actually working. And then if you look closer, you're going to see compasses. Some of these compasses in Bruno's workshop were actually made in the early 1800s, based on ones that were even made even beforehand. Planes, handmade planes, hand-carved planes, hand-forged planes as well. Lots of nails too. Sometimes you're even going to find handmade nails from the 13 and 1400s, which were hand hammered, okay, that are still there today. I've actually asked him for some. Okay, they're actually brilliant, okay, brilliantly made. But then if you look around, you're going to see wood, okay, planes, handmade tools, hand-carved frames, pieces of frames as well. And these are all aged. These are all taken from other pieces, okay, of furniture that they save in order to redo their reconstructions. You're going to hear the sound of the hammer, the handsaw, and also the scraping sound of the plane on the wood, and also the hammering of Livio is actually carving the wood to make his frames as well. Okay, you're going to see the wood chips, and also you're going to see, okay, and smell, I should say, the plant-like smell of wood, the sweet odor of pine, of oak, of cherry, the resins that come out from the wood. Also the smell of animal glues, the cooking that are bubbling, okay, on a hot plate. Beeswax, that sweet smell, and also varnishes. And these all are the sensory sort of overload as you walk in, not to mention the person in front of you is actually doing the work as well. And then the most overpowering thing is the odor of sawdust and wood shavings, excuse my misspelling, under your feet, gets in your nose as well. And some of this wood dust, okay, wood shavings have been there for decades. Okay, they usually don't clean it, okay, very often. Now, from the woodworker shop, you go to the stoneworker shop. And I put up these two images. One is the shop right next to the Duomo. I'm sure everyone's seen it, okay? It's actually one of the last ones that still keeps that sort of aura of the wood stoneworker shop of, okay, the Renaissance. This is where they repair and redo some of the sculptures for the Duomo or the baptistry or the bell tower. And this, okay, in its sort of like very theatrical sort of concept, is very much like the stoneworker shop of Paulo, which is in Artigianelli. Okay, and we have to sort of extract, well, what are the sights and sounds of the stoneworker shop? You have to understand that these shops that we're looking at, especially the one by the Duomo, were the same type of shops that produced in Greece works like the Laocoon, okay, in the Torso, excuse me, in the Belvedere in the Vatican, or Donatello's shop that produced Jeremiah, which is now in the Opera del Duomo. It's the same sights, the same sounds, and the same smells. Now, if you walk in, and this is Paulo as he's working, even though he has the modern sort of tools, and you're going to hear the sound of tools and modern power tools, you're also going to hear the sound of rhythmic hammering of chisels, the cold clanking, ringing sound of metal and stone as they still have to work with their hands because power tools still don't do it, all of it, okay, today. And when you walk into this shop by the Duomo, you're going to see that, yes, they're still using the same ancient techniques, okay, still using the chisels. You're still hearing the same hammering, okay, on the chisel, which is clicking, okay, on the marble itself. As you walk around and you see the hammers and chisels and rasps, you're going to see large pieces of stone of all different types of marble, all types of all colors, coming from all over the world, from Egypt, okay, from all parts of Italy, okay, and even in Europe. And these are all sort of pushed off to the side. It can get a little dangerous too, because these are very heavy pieces, okay, but they're sort of used to it. And then the most interesting thing about as you walk into a marble carving or a stoneworker studio is the dust, which is everywhere. And when I asked Paulo, what would be the smell that you would say would transmit someone, okay, if you walked into a stoneworker's Bottega, he said, it's not the smell in a marble workshop. It's not the odor that strikes you, but it's the taste. And as you're working with marble, which creates a very fine dust, okay, the marble dust enters into the nose, enters into the mouth, even in the hair. And the marble dust has a clean, gritty calcium taste that you can taste on your tongue and actually gets everywhere. So it works into your clothes, okay? And you have to wash it off, but it's a taste that you can literally you have in your mouth. Now, this is interesting because it actually recalls what Leonardo da Vinci said about sculptures. Now, you all know that Leonardo had a thing against Michelangelo, and Michelangelo had something against Leonardo. And they had this ongoing feud, which was the greater art, sculpture or painting? And Leonardo in his notebooks comes back with a brilliant sort of summarization of sculpting versus painting. And this is what he says. The sculptor in creating his work does so by the strength of his arm and the strokes of his hammer by which he cuts away the marble. A most mechanical exercise, often accompanied by much perspiration, which mingling with grit turns into mud. His face is smeared all over with marble powder so that he looks like a baker, and he is covered with a snowstorm of chips, and his house is dirty and filled with flakes and dust of stone. Now, having worked in marble, you find marble chips in your house all over the place. It's the exact same thing, and he nailed it perfectly. And that's why I said sculptors were inferior to painters. I'll be giving later on why he thinks painters are actually more superior. So that's what you have the marble carvers, okay, are. Now, from the hard stone, let's go from, okay, I should say, to the soft clay, the sights, sounds, smells of the ceramicist Bottega. And here we have Davide, who's working in, okay, clay, and he's using the same materials, the same techniques that Luca della Robbia, which I consider one of the greatest sculptors of the early Renaissance, what he used in order to produce his brilliant Madonnas and his brilliant works in glazed terracotta, which are as brilliant, okay, and colorful as the day they were actually made. Now, when you walk into this workshop, and I've had the opportunity to work in here, the first thing that strikes you that it's damp. It's filled with clay and the moisture that actually comes from it. You're also going to hear the sound of the wheel. There's the mechanical wheel, but then there's also the old-fashioned kicking wheel. And you'll hear the kicking sound of keeping the wheel sort of going. You're going to hear the slapping and the working of the kneading of the clay to get rid of all the air bubbles. There are machines to do it, but it's best done by hand. And these are the sights and sounds and even the smells in the ceramicist Bottega. What are you going to see also? Clay tools, cutters, brushes. You're going to feel the heat of the furnace that's roaring. Okay, usually now, well, now it's actually electric, but before it was actually a fire kiln. And you're going to see all of the baked earth, okay, the terracotta cups and glasses, and also ware that must have been also in Luca della Robbia's shop, okay, other sculptures as well. And this is interesting because the dichotomy of the dirty part of the ceramicist Bottega is in contrast to the silence of the decorators working right next door as they paint their works with these glazes. And these are some magnificent works with the meticulous sort of patience, okay, needed to produce works of this kind. Now, this is interesting because this takes us back even earlier, even back to the Greeks themselves, when you had individuals like Ergotimos and Cleithias, who were producing works like the Francois vase in the Museo Archeologico. We know their names. Ergotimos actually made it with his hands, and Cleithias actually painted it as well. And it made me think that the same precision, okay, of the individual who's actually making it and the person who's actually painting it, it's very much like, it must be very similar to the same precision of those Greek, okay, vase painters, okay, that we can still see and admire today. But if we get back to the Renaissance and you walk into the ceramicist Bottega, you're going to see these vats of white smalt that are actually used to cover the terracotta, and the terracotta vases that are ready to be sort of painted or just simply put in the oven again to be sort of heated up so it gets that nice white glaze sort of finish. And the white vats, okay, and the glazed, ready to be refired pots are very much like what must have been in Luca della Robbia's workshop, producing works like this in Santa Croce in the small chapel in the courtyards, okay, using the exact same materials, using the exact same processes as the ceramicists still do today in Florence. So what we have the damp, musty smell of the clay, the smell of wet earth, okay, the dirt, the musty smell contrast to the refinement of the clean, concentrated silence of the painting of the glazing of terracotta, okay, producing masterworks from the dirt, from the earth to absolute refinement. And then we have the sights, sounds, and smells of the bronze caster, who are using the same materials, the same processes that were used to make sculptures like Benvenuto Cellini's Perseus, okay, casting in clay. And what does this entail? Now, this is interesting because if you go to various painted Greek vases, you're going to see that bronze casting is a dichotomy sort of artistic production. You have the initial production in wax, okay, and then you have the actual forging. This is actually a forge, okay, and then the actual sort of assembling of, okay, the pieces of bronze to make the actual sculpture. So the bronze casting process is working with wax and then casting in bronze. So you have the refining part and then the sort of working with fire, the Vulcan's forge aspect of it. And what does this entail when you walk into a bronze foundry? If you ever walk into a bronze foundry, you're going to see small metal tools to work the wax. But then the most overpowering sensory sort of impact you're going to have is the pleasant odor of beeswax, since all of the preparation of the initial model is done with beeswax and it has that hot, sweet smell, almost like honey. You're also going to smell the the smell of candles, of smoke, and from heating up the wax and singeing it. You're going to hear the singeing of the wax sort of cooling immediately. And you have the refinement of the wax models, okay, that are prepared for casting. And this essentially is what you're getting into, just like the Greeks and the Romans did. Okay, the melting of the wax or retouching it with various jewelers' wax. All of this is all basically beeswax with coloring in it. And there's an overpowering smell when you're working into the refining part of the sculptures about to be actually cast in bronze. And then from here, you actually put these wax, okay, models into a huge cylinder made of fireproof sort of clay, okay? You then put these into a furnace. They're heated for 10 days. The wax runs out, which is called basically the basis for the lost wax process. And then from there, you go to the casting process. And the casting process consists of this. You have to put these huge cylinders, just like the ancients did, in a pit, bury them with sand, ready to get them ready for casting. There's dust in the air. There's a smell of sand. There's clouds in the air you can barely see. It's very similar to a construction site. There's dust, manual labor for preparing the casting, okay, is in stark contrast to the refined artistry of preparing the wax version of the sculpture for casting done in a separate part of the shop as well. And then there's actually the preparation of the bronze. So as this dust is being produced by getting these cylinders ready to be poured, okay, you have the smell of metal, the sound of the roaring furnace that gets up to 1,300 degrees Celsius. That's about 2,200 or even more degrees Fahrenheit. And you can see the bright orange glow of the molten bronze, okay, as it comes and ignites, and then you basically throw them into the furnace, and you can start to hear it and even feel the heat, okay? And as it's being heated to 1,300 degrees Celsius, okay, you're going to see this glow, this orange glow, Vulcan's forge, so to speak. Yakapo is actually covered, okay, with this heat protection. He has to throw in bits of pewter and all these other materials to make the bronze flow even better. When it is ready, okay, you pour it into a crucible that's going to be used to pour the actual works themselves. And this is absolutely fascinating. You can feel the heat literally from yards away, okay, the smell, the acrid smell of like a molten metal. And then you're ready to cast. And this is the moment of truth. As they pour this molten metal into the small little opening that actually fills in that lot where the lost wax, okay, the wax actually ran out. And what do you hear? You hear the sounds of the casters shouting directions. And this is very much like if you've ever read a description of Benvenuto Cellini as he's casting his Perseus, almost dying on his deathbed and having to all of his workers. This is what you hear. You still see and hear the same things today. It's a very tense moment. You hear the sound of the spattering bronze that hits the floor already cooled, like the sound of nails hitting the floor. You have to be very careful because they're still very hot. You can sense the heat of the molten bronze and smell the acrid smoke, the molten metal that's actually coursing through these cylinders. And after this is all done and you let it cool, you break away the mold, this is what you're left with. And this begins the whole process of the chasing. Unfortunately, there's no time to go into the actual process, the rest of the process, but the bronze making process is actually absolutely fascinating. And this is, otherwise I'd be here for the next, half hour just explaining this. Let's go to the sight, sounds, and smells of the Gilder, something a little more refined. The Gilder, this is laudo. The Gilder is very much like, in certain cases, a woodworker. He prepares panels for paintings and then gilds them. He gilds the frames. And this is, you're going to find, he has hammers in his studio, chisels, clamps, okay, to get the panels ready. This was a painting that I had to do that he actually prepared the panel and actually gilded it. And when you walk into the gilder's workshop, you're going to smell this musty natural smell of various wood, just much like the woodworker's studio. You're going to also smell the smell of animal glues, of rabbit ear glue that's bubbling, okay, on the pot, and also the smell of gesso, natural gesso, which is rabbit ear glue and gypsum. Okay, these are natural smells that have been around for centuries. You're going to hear the sound and the heat of bubbling glues and gesso on the stove as they get ready to be actually used on the wood themselves. And then there's the preparation. When that hot glue and the hot gesso and hot rabbit ear glue hits the wood, it even throws off even more smell. When it's all produced, when it's all finished, this is what you have, your finished sort of triptych, okay, the wooden panels that's all been prepared with the rabbit ear glue and the gesso, and also being prepared for the gilding. And laudo was putting on the Armenian bowl, a bowl that comes from Armenia. This is actually a bolle francese, a French type of bowl. and then he gets ready for the gilding process. Now, when someone starts to gild, there's absolute silence, because even the air that you displace when you walk will make the gold leaf literally flutter up, and that's money literally up in the air. So what do you have? You have the gilder's palette. Okay, here's Laudo cutting the gold. He has a squirrel's hair brush, a miniver brush, okay, miniver hairs. Okay, once he cuts the gold, he then wets down the area where he's going to put the gold, because remember that water is the only substance that you can use to adhere gold to a surface. You put down your water, take your squirrel's hair brush, get your static electricity out of it, put a piece of gold on it, and then gently pat it. And if you've ever watched any one gold leaf, it's absolute artistry. There's a rhythm. And as they go along, they just keep on going. It's a dance. It's an ancient dance. And they've been doing this for centuries. Laudo is one of the very last in the city that still does this to this level, okay, as well. And then we'll get to the sights, sounds, and smells of the painting restorer, Stefano. Now, Stefano was working in his studio. I took these photographs literally 2 days ago. He deals with the materials and techniques of the old masters, of all the great masters, okay, from Leonardo to Botticelli to everyone. As a paintings restorer, Stefano was trained to recreate all the aspects of old paintings, okay, the techniques in order to restore paintings from the 13, 14, and 1500s. When you walk into a studio, what are you going to find? The jars of solvents, varnishes, brushes, pigments, the smell of turpentine, of thinner, of linseed oil, and even the smell of canvas, which has a very faint sort of smell of linen as well. And then you also find amazing things like pigments. And this is a complete, okay, color sort of wall of Windsor and Newton pigments from the early 1900s. This is the way the colors came. And I'm sure this is what they came in even back into the Renaissance. Remember, they were already grinding colors. And this is what the restorers do. They got this from, I think, an antique dealer way, way back. But the most interesting thing is that when you walk into a paintings restorer studio of this level like Stefano, it comes to mind what Leonardo said about painters, especially when he's trying to say that they're superior to sculptors. This is what Leonardo says about painters: how different the painter's lot in relation to sculptors. For the painter sits in front of his work at perfect ease. He is well dressed and moves a very light brush dipped in delicate color, exactly what Stefano is like. His home is clean and filled with delightful pictures, and is often accompanied by music or by the reading of various beautiful works without the interference of hammering and other noises. Now, if you have your radio on, Stefano is doing exactly what Leonardo had. If you have your video or your book that's on the video with an audio book, it's the exact same thing. Nothing has changed. They're the exact same thing in the Renaissance. And if you look at Stefano's studio and walk through a studio, it's exactly the way Leonardo said. Beautiful pictures on the wall. Okay, it's nice and clean. There's no dust. Even has Ang's old easel, okay, that they got from an antique dealer as well. It's like an antique shop as well. So Stefano is literally the fulfillment of what Leonardo had said way back in the 1490s as well. Nothing has changed from the 1400s to today. Now, section 4, how could we conclude all of this? And we have to get into the philosophy of the Bottega. And this, I think, is the dearest aspect of the whole talk that I want to sort of relay. And let's go back to Vasari. Because Vasari, if you read Vasari's lives, he doesn't mention it often, but when he does mention the workshop or the philosophy, it's extremely interesting. It's extremely poignant in certain cases. What does he say? And this is when he's talking about the life of Luca della Robbia. The artist who from the very beginning has, as he should, a conception of what he desires to create, always moves resolutely towards perfection with the greatest of ease. Nevertheless, since all talents are not of the same stamp, there are some artisans, though they are rare, who do not do well unless they work slowly. And that's one of the concepts: patience, quality, and diligence. And then Vasari also begins to talk about ghirlandaio, and he gives us another aspect of the philosophy of the Bottega. And this is what he says about Domenico. Domenico liked to work so much and was so anxious to please everyone that he ordered his apprentices to accept whatever work came to the shop, even if it was only to make rims for the women's baskets. And if they did not want to paint them, he would do them personally, since he wanted no one to leave his shop dissatisfied. So in other words, it's prudent. You never pass up work, okay? And also willing to please. Everything that you do is basically a demonstration of the mastery of you and also of your workshop. Nothing is too small. And then we get into the life of Donatello. And what does Vasari say about Donatello, which gives us an aspect of the Bottega? He says that Donatello was very generous, kind, gracious, and more attentive to his friends than he was to himself. He never placed much importance on money and kept his in a basket suspended on a cord attached to the ceiling, from which all his workers and friends could take what they needed without saying anything to him. So he's frugal, but he's generous. And I've seen this. If someone comes to your shop and they need a pound of gesso, you give it to them, okay, willingly. You don't ask for money. In turn, when you need something from them, something cut, you go to them. And there's this interesting camaraderie that you find within the artisans. It's exactly what, okay, Vasari was trying to sort of transmit. But then what can we get from the artisans of today? If you walk into all these workshops, the workshops that I've walked into, there's an almost monastic dedication to their art. All of them are solid, sort of they seek solitude and they work in solitude. It's solitary work in the Bottega, silent study. And each of them has their own personal philosophy about the Bottega and also about work themselves. And I want to give you a quick sort of rundown. Bruno, okay, once said, "Chi lavora ha sempre torto." He who works is always wrong. Why? Because when you produce something for a patron and they ask you for less, or basically want to give you less money, it's as if you did something wrong. Now remember, even Donatello and Michelangelo had problems with patrons who didn't want to pay them the full amount. And he says it's almost as if we did the work, but we're in the wrong. And it's extremely sort of almost self-defeating. But he goes on. He considers himself the intelligente ignorante, ignorant but intelligent with his own hands. That he doesn't know how to read or write as well as he should or could, but he knows everything about wood. He knows everything how to work, all the glues, all the secret sort of techniques. And he even said, and this is just in talking with him because he passes by my studio daily, I learned everything from the workbench. In other words, everything that he does today, he learned from the bench, from working. In fact, that's what his son is actually learning from him, or has already learned from him already. And then he even said once, work becomes your vice. He says, I have no vices. My vices is work itself, much like Ghirlandaio, who never said no to anyone, even if it was painting the rims of women's baskets. And then we have the philosophy of laudo, the Gilder, and his is actually even more sort of revealing. Laudo said, craftsmen work better when they work with the creativity of an artist, and artists work better when they work with the diligence of a craftsman. And I think this is that melding of artist and artisan, which is extremely interesting, that the artists need the artisans, okay? It's closely related. They need them, okay? In fact, from, if you go to Stefano, when I was talking to Stefano, he even said, as I was talking to him, after years of work in the Bottega, it becomes your home. And you have to sort of walk in there every day in order to feel at home. And I have to admit, sometimes I go into my workshop, just sort of move things around and then leave. I'm okay with that, okay? Because I've touched base, I've stamped in and punched out as well. And then finally, the last smell that I wanted to relate to you, and this is what Bruno actually said. If you walk into the various workshops, the one odor that you're going to find is the personal odor of the labor of the artisan himself. And he said that in certain cases, and this is way back in the 50s and 60s when he was working, he said when he got pieces of wood from different people, he said it smelled like the people who actually got the wood, which is extremely, I won't go any further into that, obviously. Now, if I could bring this back around until it's like full circle, when I said what Vasari said about the death of Filippino Lippi, while he was being borne to his tomb, all of the shops in Via dei Servi were closed, as is done sometimes to the obsequies of great men. Okay, and I think I now understand this, because there's a certain camaraderie between the artisans. They all have the same philosophy on life. They may not openly state it, but they're all solitary. They're all working. They're all dedicated to their craft. And I think this is what Vasari was trying to touch on, that all of these shops lost a day's work in honor of one of their own who actually has passed. And then finally, the final conclusions, and actually got this from the father of Michaela, who's the iron worker. And I remember talking to him, and this sort of opened my whole sort of realization of what Renaissance art is. He said all of the great artists had artisans behind them, if you think about it. Brunelleschi did the dome because he had master craftsmen, iron workers, brick makers, okay, carters, woodworkers that were making everything for him. Benvenuto Cellini had master bronze casters in order to do the Perseus. Leonardo, when he was working in Milan, even working in fresco or in painting. Okay, Michelangelo, to get the marble down from the mountain. What did he have? He had woodworker, or I should say, carters and stone workers as well. All of these masters frequented the workshops. They frequented the artisans for the know-how and their information. So if you look at all of the greatest works of art in painting, sculpting, architecture, it was impossible, I would say possible, with the knowledge of the artisans and what they knew, okay, and what they had gained, the knowledge they had gained in the workshop themselves. And finally, if we want to bring us sort of the final comments to today, you can say, yes, that there are fewer true workshops than before, but some people say, oh, it's not like what it was. I think there still is. Okay, there still are, I should say. I think that the spirit of the Bottega still does survive. And the true beauty of this is in the variety of the materials and mastery, from woodworkers to gilders to stone carvers to painters to ceramicists to bronze casters, from the working of the earth and clay to the refinement of applying gold leaf to the heat of the pouring of the molten bronze. I think that the spirit of the masters of the Renaissance is still alive in the sights, sounds, and smells of the Bottega. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Alan. And as always, we'll now welcome the Zoomers in. There they are. Welcome, Zoomers. And we're open to question and answers. If you're in the room and want to make a point or ask a question, put your hand up and I'll bring you the microphone so that the Zoomers can hear you. And if you're on the Zoom, you have two routes. You can put something on the chat and I'll read it out on your behalf. But if you want to speak to us, just unmute and talk to us because we can hear you in the room. So we've got one at the back, ready to go.
Hi there. If you're from Rochester, New York, you must know the School for American Craftsmen, which is at RIT.
Yes, I do.
And they're one of the only master craftsmen, apprentice master programs in America. And they have glass, metal, wood, as you know. They also have textile.
Yep.
And I notice, you know, we have a huge history here in Italy in textile, but you don't mention it. I was wondering why.
I didn't want to go over and I haven't had the opportunity to actually work in textiles. But yes, I am familiar with RIT. I live practically right next door, and I know it's the best people who actually go there to study. They do brilliant work. Okay, in wood, amazing work. So yeah, that's an interesting point. Interesting point.
We've got more coming one here.
Can we get into these bodegas?
Yes, and there's one aspect that I forgot to mention is that if you walk in front of one and start to take pictures, it's not that they don't like it, but I once had one say, you know what, we're not performing monkeys. And there have been several very slick individuals who've tried to sort of capitalize on this, on the Bottega Fiorentine. And what's happened, and unfortunately, these people have paid money in the hopes of gaining sort of like some sort of introit or some sort of clientele, and they've been burned several times. So they're very, very closed. In fact, the reason why I have these photographs, because I know these individuals, I've known them for almost a decade, but I asked, even before I took the pictures. Many of them didn't want to be photographed. And in fact, I even said, listen, if you want a royalty, I'll give you a royalty. But you can get into them. I think it's the way you approach. I think if you are inquisitive and not just saying, oh, I'm going to make a picture because you're working with your hands, you definitely can. All of the shops that I've showed you today are right in San Frediano or in by Santa Croce. And there's others that I just didn't get a chance to even show, but there's just walk around and you'll see them. The ones that you'll know are the true ones are dirty. So they're not boutiques, they're dirty.
There's an interesting linguistic between Bottega and boutique.
Exactly.
There are a lot of different things.
Exactly. Oh yeah, the Bottega Fiorentini with the shoes, the Prada shoes.
We've got one here. Thank you very much. Wonderful talk. I work in wood, and one of the impressive things is how the hand tools have hardly changed at all.
No.
They're all the same tools.
Yes.
Exactly. Machine tools obviously different.
Right.
Now, there's two questions, one sort of practical and one philosophical. The practical one is,
only once did I see one of your photographs with a man wearing a mask.
Yeah.
And what is this sort of the health and safety rules? Because wood
Okay.
dust and stone dust can all give you diseases.
Oh, okay. In short, there are none. I was once studying marble carving in Pietrasanta, and I had my gloves, my mask, and the master would walk out in flip-flops, shorts, no mask, and just start hammering. And I even put my mask on, I sometimes have to pull chips of marble out of my eyes. And I said, how do you not get, okay, why aren't you not blind now, basically? And he said, it's easy. Every time you hit your hammer, just close your eyes. And I was like, that's brilliant. But it's interesting. And I know, unfortunately, there's some people who have, they get white lung, okay, especially working with the marble, because it actually calcifies in your lungs. It's not very good. In fact, you should, okay, probably wear sort of some sort of mask as well. So the true masters, in fact, my father who worked in wood, he said you can always tell the true sort of sign of a true master woodworker if they're missing one of their fingers. And it's actually true. It's actually true. Bruno has a slight sort of missing a piece of his thumb, and unfortunately, that's the reality of the craft of the discipline.
Can I just go on to the other thing? I mean, interesting the camaraderie and how within a group of people like this, they will help each other without counting the cost, without counting the time. Can you just say something about the attitude of the artisans you've seen to money? Okay,
it's extremely interesting. Not just from my own personal, because if you, in fact, we're talking to Bruno. Bruno, he stops and he leaves, and I've been writing down these things every time he says, and he says that se tu sei buono, non sarai mai ricco. He said, if you're good, you're never going to be rich. And he says that, you know, I do what I do because I love it. Okay, obviously I'm going to get money for it. I just want what I asked for. The true artisan, in certain cases, and I've done it, sometimes you do works just because you want to do them, because it's an opportunity. In relation to money, it's like Donatello. Okay, you put money in a basket and let people actually take from it. Now, obviously, these people have to survive, but I would, you know, I would guess that most of these individuals, okay, would do it just because they love it. Again, they have to make money off it, and they ask honest prices, but they're not going to try to gouge you. Now, some do. I mean, they're not. I'm not saying they're all sort of angels. In fact, most of these artisans made a lot of money in the '80s, and they were making things and shooting them with lead shot, and in order picking out the lead balls and saying that they were sort of like termites, to try and make it look like from the 1400s. But I think the attitude is, it's not important. It's the actual craft that's the most important. It's an interesting question. It's something I couldn't even get into. So thank you for bringing it up.
There's a couple more in the room, but I want to give the Zoomers a chance. Does anyone want to unmute and talk to us? There's a comment here. No. Jane, talk to us.
Hello, Simon. Hello, Alan. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah,
I can hear you beautifully.
Great. It was a wonderful talk, and nice to be in the Institute again in spirit, if not in person. I was struck, of course, by the fact that all the wonderful workshops you featured had no women working in them. And then I was thinking about my own work I'm doing mainly on Renaissance art, and thinking about how obviously there were some women who ran their own workshops, not many, but there were. But very often the women, possibly the painter or sculptor's wife, would be the manager of the workshop, and maybe did the books and sort of did some of the, you know, getting the commissions and just sort of actually running the business side. And I wondered if there were any parallels there, and what you think about the whole female work issues, and where the women crafts persons now.
Sure. Can I answer? And you can hear me. It's a great question. In fact, I think I alluded to it very quickly. Is at the ceramicist workshop, the individual Davide that I showed you, he learned everything from his mother, but the mother didn't want to be photographed. So, because she was doing all the ceramics, the painting of it. So I think that today, I think everything that you see today happened way back then. I don't think there's any changes whatsoever. So I think what you're saying is actually true. I know that there were probably female masters, quote unquote, running workshops. and teaching individuals. Now, we know there were female painters, as we all know, but if you can go back to Boccaccio, I think mentions of female painters who undoubtedly had individuals who were studying with them as well. So the one workshop that I think I just alluded to, yes, the son actually learned everything from his mother, who actually keeps the whole workshop together. It's her workshop as well, which is an interesting point.
And before we go to the questions in the room, I just want to thank tonight's sponsor. We have a sponsor for the lecture, Penny Howard, is with us. Thank you, Penny. And Penny is one of increasing band of friends and supporters of the Institute who choose to sponsor lectures. I see Barbara Hollowell's up there, back in San Diego, not Santa Barbara, who's also been sponsoring, but had to go home because he broke her ankle. But I hope you're getting better, Barbara. And Christopher Hyder, Jane Lewis, and others joined Michael Griffiths, who's also with us this evening, who's been our king sponsor for some years. But it's good that many more people are coming on board. I set myself an objective to wind up having every lecture sponsored. So if you're interested in helping me to achieve that goal, it's all on the website. So thanks, Penny, particularly for tonight, for sponsoring Alan's lecture.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, more questions in the room. I saw one here and then one at the back.
I'm interested in knowing about the commercial side of the Bottega business now in Florence. How are people finding clients? These look like things from the Renaissance. So do they have websites? Do they have agents? How do they find the people who want their crafts, want their furniture, or have a painting restored?
Right. Okay, it's a really good question. The individuals that I know don't even have fax machines in certain cases. I mean, I think they may have had one and they got rid of it. It's not good. Let's put it this way, because some of these individuals have been working for so long. It's very difficult to adapt to the ever-changing sort of economic world. Websites, and this is what I was saying, these people who came in and they understood that there could be money made from this. They said, we'll do everything, pay us €250, we'll give you a website. And unfortunately, nothing was done. That was just one thing. So they've been burned, and they're very, very careful about that. In many cases, the ones that I've worked with, well, the bronze casters, for example, they have more work than they can get their hands on. One bronze caster said the other day, if I stop taking commissions right now, I could work for the next 2 years just on what I have to do. So bronze casting is going great guns because some of the best bronze casters are right here in Tuscany. Cile Cavai are two. Okay, there's several ones. So the bronze casters have no problems. The woodworkers have their own clientele. In fact, Bellini, which is right down the road, was making and giving a lot of work to these woodworkers as well. The painting restore has a very good sort of clientele in the upper echelons of Sotheby's and Christie's. So it's not to say that they're not poor, because in the 80s, these individuals were making a lot of money. And that one even said that we had people lining up outside our doors. We had to turn people away because there was the quest for something old, okay? And they had it, and sometimes they made new things look old, which is a whole other discourse that I can't really go into, okay? And in fact, I was just talking with Bruno today that the Florentine workmen basically furnished all of the Bolognese antique shops for years, the 60s and 70s. They would come here with trucks, okay, empty trucks, and then run away, okay, filled with cassoni and tables and paintings as well. So I would say that many of them haven't made that jump into hyperspace, okay, so to speak. But they still have their very, very faithful sort of clientele base that keeps them going. If that answers your question, it's a touchy subject. Yeah, it really is. It really is.
For those of you who follow Lynn Cancel's work in the Bardini archives, they know that that's an ancient tradition in Florence's manufacturing ancient work.
Yes. Yeah, can't talk too much about that.
I can't even tell you how much I look forward to this. I'm an American entrepreneur that has created products like for Home Depot and Lowe's that have been there for 30 years. I have this fascination with the guild system. I know this is a dream, it will never happen. I would like to help recreate it. I have those kind of skill sets because what you have described is still there.
It's still there.
Still there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I can't thank you enough.
No, you're very welcome. If I can just expand on this 1 second.
Sure.
What's happened is that everything has changed, been put into the university system. And this sort of get your 4 years or get your degree in something in woodworking. And RIT is actually an exception to this because of what, but the people who I just showed you should be in the university. They should have the cathedra. They should be teaching individuals. They have no people coming to them saying, teach me. And that's why the things that they've shown me, it's like, my gosh, we should film this because once Bruno is gone, okay, who's been working for 70 years in this, we're going to lose a whole cultural history that is almost impossible to regain. So the guild system would be very interesting. I think it would work. I think, pardon the pun, but I think that it's something that be interesting to try and do because you'd be saving this cultural history that I think is just be a shame to just let it go away, let it die. Interesting point.
There's quite a lot of international artists and artisans who are setting up contemporary Bottega, and in a sense you're one yourself.
Right.
Do you think they have a contribution that it could be useful for solving this problem of how you don't lose the skills and traditions?
See, the problem is, in fact, as an example, Daniel Day-Lewis, when he left acting, he went to Santo Spirito and he learned how to make shoes. No one knew this. I don't know if you remember Daniel Day-Lewis. Okay, he had his long hair, he had his cap on. I had an individual who lived right next to him for 3 years, never said anything. When Daniel Day-Lewis left, he wrote on a post-it, "Thanks for leaving me alone for these 3 years." She didn't know that she was living next to Daniel Day-Lewis. Okay. But the problem is that, yes, and the frustration is that many foreigners come and they're actually brilliant, but then they go away, and then they don't remain. And not to say that they shouldn't go away, but the problem is that, and in essence, they're actually sort of taking it to another level, but it never really comes back to the Florentine, sort of the Florence itself, which is sort of a shame.
Michael, back. Calm down.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Listening to you talking about Bottega in Florence, I started to come out of Florence into the country roundabout. We live in the village of San Pancrazio on the Certaldesi Road. It's Machiavelli, Guicciardini country. And over the years, we've become great friends with the local craftsmen, the painter and decorator, the carpenter, the restorer. They don't have Botteghe. Their whole motivation is being able to create things. The painter and decorator discovered some frescoes in our house, and the restoration of these was a highlight, in his life.
I can believe it.
The restorer, who had the wonderful name of Giotto Bagnoli, used to work when he was a young man in a Guicciardini farm, 1.5 hours away. He had to walk every morning, leaving at 4:30 to be there at 6 o'clock and to come back again 6 days a week. He was a craftsman. I mean, he was wonderful. Nothing would satisfy him more than restoring a piece of furniture for us. And also our local electrician. I mean, you might not think an electrician is a craftsman, but my lord, he can be, really. And all these people are marked by the fact it's extended. It is an Italian characteristic of being marvelous at creating things, whatever it happens to be. So this thing of a Bottega does extend out right into the country, I think. And I mean, it's a marvelous. The hallmark that all of them have is contentment for what they're
Exactly.
doing.
Exactly.
Giotto Bagnoli, you know, that life that he had, you could say he was exploited, you know. Never a word of grumbling. He had to walk and through every weather to get to work and come back again. And they were, I feel like I don't want to go over the top, but natural nature's a gentleman, really.
Exactly.
But it runs right. It's an Italian characteristic, which
Right.
I think is, you know, a patrimony of Italy, which is just amazing, which you summed up so well tonight in your talk. But it goes out into the local villages. Go and find your local painter and decorator. Find out what he's really interested in, your woodworker.
Right.
They will be, you know, artists in their own sense. That's all. And thank you very much indeed.
No, I think it's a great point. Thank you very much for that one too.
I'm sorry, we didn't have a lot to say about electricians, but I guess I should get them to.
No.
Sorry. Forgive me, Michael. Okay, any more for any more? Because we're going towards the tradition of sharing a glass of wine, but before we do that, so Brenda, yes, talk to us.
Yeah, hello. Hi, Simon. I just a couple of comments really. I'd just like to applaud Alan for his consistent way of digging out aspects of our art and art history that are often ignored. I'm particularly interested in the overlap between the artist and the skill of the artisan and the apprenticeship system. I'm glad to say that one of my sons actually did an apprenticeship rather than go to a university course, and he's an excellent photographer. And the final thing I'd just like to say is apropos of a comment on that whose lies in the Santa Maria novella at the moment, she in the Renaissance had a workshop which consisted only of women. She was a nun in Florence, and
Sure.
so you probably know about her. But just make the comment that she had her own workshop, and it was only women that attended the workshop.
Good point. Thank you.
The line was distorted there, but I think Brenda was talking about Sornelli.
Yeah. Good point. Thank you.
Plautilla Nelly. Yeah. Anyway, thanks so much. Excellent.
Thank
lecture.
you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
There was one or two more in the room. Yeah.
I know there's some schools here in Florence that teach drawing, painting, sculpture. I wondered if you had your favorites, ones that you think are teaching in the style of Leonardo and Michelangelo.
You know, there's so many schools. Florence Academy of Art, the Angel Academy. I have a friend right here, Martino, actually teaches at the school. He's a brilliant painter and instructor. You know, Florence, it's an interesting discourse because you have to come to Florence and understand what you want from it. If you want to paint and draw like Michelangelo and Leonardo, you do it like the master system. You just go and you copy, you draw from it. If you want something a little more disciplined, okay, which actually can help you get from point A to point B, then there are these academies, like I said, the Angel Studios, the Florence Academy of Art. What's very difficult is the master apprentice system, which is it's based on you. And I think I said this about Cennini, it's the ones who go into this are the ones who are with natural enthusiasm, and you want to work on your own. And in fact, in seeking out a master, sometimes the best way to do it is just find someone who, a good painter, a good sculptor, and just sort of study with them like I did. I studied fresco painting with this one Spanish woman who was a fresco restorer. And then I studied sculpting with Antonio Di Tommaso, because these are the people that I really wanted to learn from. And that's how it was in the Renaissance. But you can't do that with 500 people. And that's why these academies are actually perfect. So the ones that I mentioned are actually some of the best that I know of eventually.
And you famously studied drawing with Michelangelo.
Yeah.
And you didn't steal the drawing.
No. Anyway.
No, what? I think we're probably at the natural end. We've run the normal course. Before we go and have a delicious glass of Frescobaldi wine, we're still with Frescobaldi at the moment. I want to thank Penny again, thank Michael for his overarching support of everything we do here. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Zoomers, for zooming in from all over the world. Val Ward has got a hand up. Oh, it's gone down again. It's fine today. Thank Alan for another wonderful lecture. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Hold on.